Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the 16th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 24, or Proper 19, which falls on September 12th this year. One content notification for this episode. In our deep dive, we are talking about hard things and learning hard things, which means that we are mentioning examples of harmful biases, words, and actions. It's kind of we're talking about all the things. So if you don't have the space for that, that's okay. Skip over it to the first reading and catch it maybe some other time, or just skip over it.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Our deep dive for today is learning hard things. There's been a lot of learning, especially for those of us who have different identities of privilege, for those of us who are white, for those of you who are cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied,
and for that matter, those of us who are not epidemiologists.
For those of us who are not epidemiologists or infectious disease experts.
Indeed.
And for those of us who don't live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn and a lot that we don't normally learn in school or on our own. So we have to be intentional about learning it. One of the more obvious places where we don't always learn well is history. There are many examples that we could use from what we learn about Native people in the past and in the present to how we are taught about slavery and the Civil War. But one of the most poignant examples for me about the importance that framing and language makes in teaching history and in understanding things is what I learned about the Holocaust versus how I understand the Holocaust now. When I was in, elementary school, middle school, high school, I feel like we learn about the Holocaust pretty young.
Yes.
When I was in grade school, as they say, I learned that 6 million people died in the Holocaust. Specifically, I learned that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Today, I would tell you that in fact, in the Holocaust, 11 million people, over half of whom were Jewish, were systematically targeted and killed as part of a multi-group genocide, which included people as wide-ranging as Jewish people, Romani people or Roma people, Jehovah's Witnesses, disabled people, queer people, especially trans women and gay men, political dissidents, and socialists. That's a very different way of understanding it, right? One puts it in passive voice. People died instead of people were actively targeted and killed.
Right.
It takes away the responsibility of those in power and those with power and privilege in that situation for what happened. And it's important also to recognize the full breadth of who all was targeted and killed in the Holocaust, because Romani or Roma people are still very hated in much of Europe and throughout the world. And so when we don't teach the full history, we aren't able to then challenge the problematic things about it so that they don't keep happening.
Yeah. And for that matter, when you're saying, were they just trying to make it easier to teach in the classroom? Personally speaking, I learned the same thing in elementary school about the Holocaust. In that grade, I had 2 Jewish classmates and a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses classmates. And I have never thought about it before, but I wonder how the Jehovah's Witnesses students felt when we focused on the Jewish people and ignored what happened to them. Another way that we've been talking about history recently is through the lens of critical race theory. In the same way that Lutherans like to say that we read the Bible through the lens of Jesus Christ, one of the ways that we can study history is through the lens of what's called critical race theory, which is when we take a look at history and we ask ourselves, how does race play into this? How did race play into what happened, what the choices people made, and their priority structure? And this has become something of a catchphrase in a way that has led to racist propaganda. And the truth is that critical race theory is about figuring out the truth, which is supposed to be what history is about. You can't understand history unless you know what was motivating people. And if racism was a part of that, which it almost certainly was in a lot of places and for a long time and still is, then you have to acknowledge that. If you start randomly ignoring stuff in history, you're not actually going to learn anything useful. And so when a parents group in the U.S. several months ago now objected to a grade school classroom reading a book about Ruby Bridges because it didn't have a happy ending and it didn't paint the white community in a good light, maybe that's because history doesn't always have a redemption arc if we don't, create one in the actual world to put into history.
Yep. Maybe it's because white people haven't shown up and done the right thing yet.
Yes. So, yes, we have had problems as America being able to talk about critical race theory in constructive ways, and many of us have had trouble facing that truth. And for that matter, facing truths that apply to ourselves are often the most difficult ones to deal with. I have had a few conversations recently that involve my trying to point out, I realize you were trying to say this one thing. Instead, you also managed to say this other thing. I don't think you wanted to do that. Here's how you can not do that again. And that is sometimes hard for people to hear, which I get. In one case, I was trying to point out, I don't think you intended to be incredibly ableist when you said that, but disabled people are actually allowed to make their own decisions. And that led to a Twitter conversation where I was accused of villainizing someone by saying, that thing you just said, it sounded like ableism. I assume you didn't want that to sound like ableism. And I also find myself starting conversations among my colleagues, because we are Lutheran pastors and I personally am of German descent. I wind up having a lot of conversations about anti-Semitism and how casual conversation can lead so easily into sounding anti-Semitic when we're spending all this time talking about the Bible, which involves a lot of Jewish people, oddly enough. Like that might surprise some folks, but
it's like they're most of the people in the Bible.
Yeah. So those are often hard conversations too. And to be honest, I am not always the person pointing this out. I am often also the person having this stuff pointed out to me. And I find it very helpful. And by all means, if you notice that I say something and I seem to also be saying something else that's terrible, I want you to tell me about it. I want to not say that stuff. But even if in the moment it's not easy to hear, it's helpful. And it makes me better at my job and also probably a better human being.
Yeah. I have a group of friends, and one of the things that I've been noticing more frequently is the different words that we use that are ableist, that are so ingrained in our speech, right? When we talk about, oh, that's crazy, or we say, that's so dumb, or those sorts of things. And so what we've taken to doing in our group is I'll just rephrase it, or I'll just say, maybe not dumb, but mean, or maybe not crazy, but wild. And it's enough of a key in for folks that then it's like, oh yeah, right. And then it's restated. And that's one of the best things is, you're right, I'm sorry, thank you, restate it the right way, and keep moving on. And one of the things that is kind of what Kay was talking about with people reacting really negatively. So if we're pointing out racism to a white person, we call that white fragility. And sometimes, especially white women, will react with white tears, where they will feel hurt because they have been called out about something they did wrong. And this is a great reminder to check out our episode from the second Sunday after Pentecost, where we talked with Reverend Callie Swanland about shame and guilt and the work that, in particular, Brene Brown has done around that.
Yay, Brene Brown.
And Brene Brown in general.
Yeah.
When we have deep shame and guilt, that prompts those reactions, right? Those reactions are examples of guilt being turned into shame, right? Where we feel bad as people, and that keeps us from learning, as opposed to what I hope I do, and I don't always do it perfectly, but I try to do, is if I mess up in public, you can call me out in private or call me out in public. And if you call me out in private, I'm probably still going to try and do something publicly to correct
Sure.
and to name the harm that I caused. But also, the best process in this, I kind of talked about that, is when someone calls you out to say, thank you for telling me.
Yes.
I'm sorry. To correct that behavior if you can, or to make a plan to do it differently and to move forward.
Yeah.
Unless it's something egregious. But
please don't make it about you.
Yep, when you mess up my pronouns, you just correct yourself, keep going, and practice on your own.
As a cisgender woman, I have on occasion desperately wished that I had a coffee mug that was labeled with, in giant letters, man pain, so that I could, drink from that. And it's not that I hate men. I'm, happily married to one. But there are times when I just have absolutely no patience left for that crap. And so when I think of my, imaginary man pain mug, I also remember, probably my colleagues of color have a similar mug that says white tears on it, and I can't blame them.
Yep.
Like, the amount of crap that they've gone through. Or my trans colleagues have mental mugs
tears.
with, white cis tears, or various other options. My disabled colleagues have, ableism mugs, etc. And so remembering that everybody has their own mental mug is one way to keep myself humble and hear these reminders in useful ways.
Yep. Part of what we're also talking about is the idea of call-out culture or even cancel culture, both of which get really bad raps, and they're actually really good things.
We can talk about this stuff now. Yes.
Yeah, right?
It's a good
We're
sign.
actually holding people accountable for things. And no, nobody's perfect. And there's, ways in which call-out and cancel cultures can be used unhelpfully.
Yes.
But the reality is that call-out culture, and especially cancel culture when it comes to celebrities, is actually called consequences.
Yes.
Right? When someone is called out for bad behavior, that's like, when I'm called out for bad behavior, I am grateful because someone thinks that I have the ability to change and to grow and to learn. And they're willing to invest that time in telling me that.
Yes.
And that's a big deal. And when we cancel someone, when we say, no, you have sexually harassed too many people,
yes,
we're done with you, it's consequences.
Yes.
When people abuse power, they should not be allowed to stay in power.
Exactly.
They need to be removed from power, both for those that they've harmed and for their own selves, to keep them from continuing to do those harmful things, because it's not good for them to be doing those harmful things either.
Yes. And one of the parts of this conversation that continues to just befuddle the living daylights out of me, to use language that Apple will not object to, is that I keep meeting people who are convinced that all of their relatives going back in time have been lovely, perfect examples of the human race. And therefore, those people cannot possibly have done anything bad or meant to do anything bad or had bad intentions. And therefore, they also themselves cannot do any of those things. I fundamentally don't understand that, because I've had the knowledge that one of my great-grandparents was a terrible person on like 18 different levels since I was maybe 8. And so I don't groak that, to use the ancient Heinlein reference, speaking of someone who was deeply flawed and yet also managed to do some really interesting things.
You don't what?
I don't grok that. G-R-O-K. It goes back to the novel Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein. And to grok something is to understand it at a very deep level and have it viscerally make sense to you without necessarily having to have it fully explained. And I have that with some stuff. I don't have it with this. And so I understand that there are people who go through life like that. I don't understand what that would be like. But the idea that, yes, we are talking about this stuff, yes, we admit that it happens, is so powerful and so important, because part of that story of my great-grandparent is also how that affected their child and what happened to that child and how that child never got to admit any of that stuff until they were elderly, because there was just too much denial going on, and the society wouldn't allow it.
When I think about that, and there are certain things I know about my family that I've kind of always known, and then there are other things where I've traced both sides of my family back far enough that I'm fairly confident that we did not own slaves at any point. We've been here longer than I thought we had, but did not own slaves. And yet, my grandfather was a head elk in Georgia in the 50s.
Yeah.
And he's white, right? And so there's no way he wasn't part of the KKK.
Yeah.
And that is something that I didn't, right? It's part of how we frame history. It didn't ever cross my mind until my uncle a couple years ago pointed out those facts to me. And I was like, oh.
Yeah.
But I always knew that as a white person, I benefit from systems that have been set up forever, but I didn't know the more intimate family connections to that. And that gives me more space and more reason to work harder against it. Not that I wasn't before, but I think it's always helpful when we have more and more motivation to do something.
Right.
It's helpful to work against racism because it's bad for people of color. And it's helpful to work against racism because it's bad for white people. And it's helpful to work against racism because my grandfather worked for it so hard.
Yes.
Each of those things makes my need to work for it and my commitment to working against racism and to working against white privilege and white supremacy that much stronger.
Yeah, I do understand that sense of suddenly understanding things in entirely new ways. And everything means completely different things now. Yeah.
And now that it's out in the open, then we can talk about it. And I can talk with my dad about what it was like.
Sure.
But now we can have, as a family, more open and honest conversations about what our family was like. Because when we repress it, like you mentioned, right? When we repress it, it comes out sideways. It causes other types of harm.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Just not good to deny reality.
Yeah, it's amazing how actually knowing the truth can fix so many things or lead to so many things being able to be fixed.
Yep. Yeah.
So deal with the truth even when it's difficult is, I guess, the overall point we're going for here.
You can do hard things and you can learn hard things too.
And not only do we believe in you, but so does Brene Brown.
Yes. And Jesus.
Yes, Jesus too. We should probably bring up Jesus now and then on this podcast. Our first reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 9a. The prophet declares that God has made them a teacher. Since God is with them, persecution from other people will happen, but will not be the ultimate authority. And so the prophet will trust in God for vindication.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of moral conviction. The prophet is talking about this moral conviction that they have no matter what else happens. And it reminded me of the show Firefly, which I really love. And in it, Malcolm and the main crew of the Serenity have really strong moral convictions about what is right and what is wrong, and those don't always line up with what is legal and illegal, and I love that distinction. And in the game Firefly, based on the show and movie, they actually label characters as moral characters or not moral characters, and then the jobs that they take are moral or immoral and legal or illegal.
Sure.
And so then there are repercussions if you take an immoral job, even if it's a legal job. If it's immoral, it affects the crew because they are a moral crew.
Right.
I really appreciate that distinction because we don't make that distinction clearly enough, especially with the laws that exist in the United States.
Yeah.
We need to be a lot clearer about which laws are moral and which laws are not. Spoiler, lots of them are not.
Yeah.
As we dive into the verses, in verse 4, we read, "The becoming God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word." And I was thinking about, so frequently my examples for this go to the Lord of the Rings and those speeches to weary battlers, which is lots of violent imagery. But what I actually thought of was Katniss in Mockingjay, when they're in District 2 and all the districts are fighting against District 2 and they crack the nut and District 2 floods out and it's about to be this huge battle and really everybody is sick of fighting each other. And Katniss runs in and tells everybody to stop, and has this really clear speech about the futility of the fighting between the districts, and that the actual goal is to take on the capital because the capital is the one oppressing everybody. And it's this beautiful shift of focus and reminder to people of who actually causes the weariness and where the actual change needs to take place. And then she gets, shot and not killed. But it was a good speech.
If you're going to get shot and not killed, by all means, best of luck making a good speech first. Yeah.
I mean...
Not the worst outcome.
Cinna made her outfit, so she's pretty safe.
Yeah.
As long as they didn't hit her head, and they didn't.
In verse 5, we read, "The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I did not turn backward." So earlier today, I was listening to a recent episode of NADPod, Not Another D&D Podcast. And so I immediately have now mentally translated this verse as, I did not fail the wisdom check. I did not fail the wisdom check this time, and therefore turn around and try to go the wrong way. Or at least this time. Which handily implies that failing the wisdom check is absolutely an option that may still happen at a later date, which is also always true. So.
Mm-hmm. That's why, like we learned in our Jesus Loves You series, we should pay attention when wisdom invites us to eat at her table.
Exactly. And try to go the right direction.
Exactly. In verse 6, we read, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting." And it feels like cheating to say this because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are so very explicitly tied by C.S. Lewis to Jesus and the Bible, but I definitely thought of Aslan and the White Witch when Aslan goes in place of Edward and lies down, and the witch literally orders them to strike Aslan and pull out Aslan's mane and shave him and all of that stuff. It's like Christian fan fiction is consistent sometimes with what is written in the Bible, to the letter.
Especially if the person writing it has actually, read some of the Bible, that usually helps.
Right? It's amazing. Disclaimer, C.S. Lewis is not perfect, and those books are certainly not perfect from a gender lens, but...
Also, controversial opinion, my immediate reaction on reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at the age of 8 or 9 was not that this was an homage to the Bible, but that C.S. Lewis just straight up stole the plot. And I was incredibly furious. So, I do not have the emotional attachment that a lot of Christians do to those books.
That's fantastic. You thief!
Like, this is just straight up plagiarism. I object, dude. And then finally, in verse 7, we read, "The Lord God helps me, therefore I have not been disgraced, therefore I have set my face like flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame." So, what character from a universe that you love has the best poker face, is the question that this inspires in me. Who could set their face like flint in a way that even God would notice and be impressed?
I was thinking set your face like flint, like, all right, you're ready to start a fire, but okay.
I mean, sometimes that's why you have a poker face.
That's true.
I mean, I don't go there, but I hear that Katniss from the Hunger Games is pretty good at that.
She's okay at it, but Haymitch is way better because he doesn't let anything through when there's, like, all sorts of scheming going on around her back. Yeah. He has a different kind of poker face. It just, like,
also,
shows
he has
other
a few
emotions
more decades experience, and my experience with people who have quit drinking is that they tend to have the best poker faces. They have seen some stuff, and they don't react to much anymore. So
that's also true.
My classic example from my childhood is that Spock from Star Trek the original series is very good at this unless he's been drugged, which happens a few times and is always deeply, deeply weird.
Janet from The Good Place.
Oh, yes. Yes, she is very good at that.
That's my vote.
Not that she knows that she's good at it or that she wants to be, but yes.
Our second reading for this episode is James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. The author reminds us that teachers have great power to shape and guide others, even with the smallest of words or actions, and therefore we must be especially careful with what we say, and will be judged more harshly by others.
Before we start on this reading, I would just like to throw a quick shout out. Back in our HP at Church days, I believe every single time that a text about teaching came up, we basically wound up fawning over the fabulousness that is Professor McGonagall, and I didn't actually bring her up this time, so I just want to say yay, Professor McGonagall, and then we can move on.
Yes, Professor McGonagall, best and only competent teacher at Hogwarts.
Well, Madam Hooch was not bad, but yes.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. There are a couple competent ones.
Yeah.
Just few and far between.
I would not want to teach flying to those students.
Oh, yeah, no. Speaking of teaching, one of the themes of this passage is the power of speech. Teaching has a lot to do with speech. And I was thinking about it, and there are so many. I wonder actually a little bit if part of what I love about fiction and about reading and shows and movies is, in fact, that they have, like, compelling speeches. Because I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, President Bartlett had some really good speeches and some really good talking points and stuff during debates and those sorts of things. And then I was like, well, and there's Lord of the Rings and the rouse the people to battle speeches,
yes.
and Katniss in the Hunger Games, as I already mentioned, and all of those things. And so, I don't know, it just got me thinking about powerful speeches, and there are a lot of them, and they are compelling. That's why we memorize ones like the Gettysburg Address or Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech.
Absolutely.
Because they pull us into something, because of their power.
I once thought that to the extent where I bought a book that was a collection of the best speeches of all time or something like that, because I wanted to learn how to, preach better. And I finished about 2 of them before I lost it, which should have been a sign that I had ADHD. But I'm diagnosed now, so it's okay.
Now you know.
Yes, exactly. In verse 1 we read, "Not many of you should become teachers, my siblings, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." And I have to admit that the older I get, as much as I still absolutely love reading Calvin and Hobbes cartoons, which I am regularly supplied with via a Twitter account, which is a gift of technology that I did not expect, I have to say I still have more and more sympathy and respect for Mrs. Wormwood, his teacher. You don't really get to see much of her beyond her reacting to Calvin's behavior, but you do get the sense that she is actually very good at her job, and she is one of the ones who should be a teacher, but he judges her strictly. I would also really love to be a fly on the wall for a conversation between Mrs. Wormwood and Calvin's parents at some point. That would be so much fun. But, yeah.
Yeah. Huh. In verse 5, we read, "So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits." There are many things I could think of on this one, but the nerdy thing that came to mind was, this is, in fact, the power of a bard.
Yes.
And my first D&D character was a bard, and so I have a special place in my heart for bards, and I'm not a musical person, so especially at the beginning of being a bard, I think the first test was to come up with some rousing speech or poem or something. And so I did a spoken word thing that I very quickly wrote out in 5 minutes while other people were doing theirs. I was like, I need 5 minutes to figure this out.
Sure.
And so while everybody's like doing their character test things, I'm like, and then I had like my rousing speech and, the great exploits of bards that can change the fate of an entire war or group or campaign.
Sure. Absolutely.
Go bards, go.
Go gadget bards? Probably not. No. Okay. In verse 8 we read, "But no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison." Yeah, you can do a lot with just words, and it's not always good stuff either. Just ask Loki Silvertongue from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or ask Grima Wormtongue from Lord of the Rings, or a example that came to mind later, which still horrifies me to this day, the Doctor from Doctor Who, when he says, "Doesn't she look tired?" For those of you who went through David Tennant's run.
That is not what you ever say about a person.
That's how he took down a British Prime Minister, who he had actually put into power in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Harriet Jones.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yep.
One of the few times I have really just wanted to smack the Doctor across the face. Well, okay, actually, there have been several times, but that was one of the first. And probably also one of the hints that I didn't actually like David Tennant's Doctor that much. But
Interesting, because a lot of people love David Tennant's character.
Yeah.
I started with Matt Smith. And on principle, I like the latest two the best, even though I haven't seen any of those episodes yet, because I really want to like rewatch all of the Doctor Who.
Sure.
I tried to start at the very, very beginning. It was too hard.
Yeah, it helps to watch the like Doctors number 8 and earlier with someone who grew up with Doctor Who.
Mm. Huh.
It makes more sense when you have them there to explain the lore, that kind of thing.
That makes more sense.
Sure. But yeah, my favorite Doctor will always be Christopher Eccleston. So.
I did not like him. He was weird.
Yeah, he's supposed to be.
But yeah. In verse 9, we read, "With our tongue we bless the becoming God and caregiver, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God." And this reminded me in Pose, the treatment of the landowner. The little landowner lady is like evil white lady. And Blanca passes, which is a complicated thing.
Yeah.
The landowner doesn't know that Blanca is transgender when she rents the space for her nail salon, and then finds out later that she is. And she is like super sugary sweet and goes to the benefit concert that Blanca is organizing and pays and gives money and then takes people out to dinner. All the while, somebody else is going to the nail salon and burning it and destroying it. And it's especially poignant because this comes to light so clearly for her in her discrimination and prejudice against people with HIV. And Blanca has HIV, though I don't know if she knows that officially. I don't know if the landowner knows that officially or not. But she has this sugary sweet, "Oh, bless you, gay people are great," while completely sabotaging Blanca's livelihood. Don't do that, people.
Our gospel reading for this episode is from Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. Jesus teaches the disciples that as the Messiah, he will suffer, die, and rise again on the third day. The disciples have trouble accepting this, and Jesus invites them to take up their cross and follow him.
So one of the themes in this passage is the theme of identity. Jesus is figuring out what other people think his identity is and establishing his own identity and what it means to be a Messiah. And it reminded me actually a lot of Laia in the Ember and the Ashes series, where there are so many different ways that she is identified by other people as the lioness's daughter, as a resistance fighter, all of these different ways. But for her, the thing that she most identifies with is the armband, the silver armband that her mother gave her. And that is the way that she always reminds herself of who she is when she touches the armband, when she holds the armband. That brings her back into herself and into her identity.
Cool. And I think a lot of us have done things like that. Like, for years, I wore my high school class ring as sort of a reminder of, if I did that, then I can do this kind of thing.
I am really such a dork. I wore my name tag from when I worked at camp.
Sure.
The entire, for 2 years, I just wore it everywhere.
Sure.
It was really funny. People thought that I, worked places that I didn't work, and...
Yeah.
Don't do that anymore, but...
Well, sometimes you need the reminder. I went to camp one year, and somebody put a friendship bracelet on me, and I did not remove that friendship bracelet until the day before I left to go back to that camp the following year, because I was going to see the same people.
Nice. Yeah, I used to do that with friendship bracelets, too. I would just wear them until they fell off, but yeah.
Yeah. In verse 27, we read, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So I'm thinking this is less like Regina George in Mean Girls demanding to be updated on the latest gossip, and more like Colonel O'Neill from Stargate asking Daniel, the translator, whether these people around them are about to start trying to kill them or not. I'm just saying, I suppose the ongoing lesson from this is don't cast Jesus as Regina George in almost any story. That just doesn't seem accurate. But
or Regina George as Jesus.
Yeah, no.
Either way, bad combo. Except for, last week.
Well, or at the end, doesn't she wind up playing, is it lacrosse or something, to work on her anger management? And that makes me wonder what teenage Jesus would have done to work on his anger management. because he must have had some, because, I mean, imagine being the son of God and being surrounded by teenagers. Oh, my goodness.
I mean, he does, take out his anger on some property.
Yes, but like that,
in the
that
way
seems
of property
reasoned
destruction.
and intentional and, on purpose.
Well, and I also was looking at verse 27, and I was actually thinking again of Ember in the Ashes and the foretold emperor, who people say that is this one who comes about because of these 3 trials, and so then that would make it where Marcus, who wins the trials, is said to be the foretold emperor, but the reality is not all of the pieces line up, and the foretold emperor is actually somebody else, and so it's figuring out who is the actual emperor and what does it mean to be the foretold emperor. What does it mean to be the Messiah?
Sure.
And then in verse 34 we read, Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So this is a particular verse that is used out of context frequently and in really harmful ways. So to be clear, this does not mean stay in a situation where you are being harmed.
Yes.
That's not what it looks like. But I think about this, and I just finished marathoning the Sense8 series, and it is not a perfect series, but I really enjoyed it. Certain people are connected telepathically, basically, with 7 other people, and they form a cluster. And so there's this sense that in becoming part of a cluster and accepting being part of the cluster versus trying to get out of the cluster, which you can't do unless you die or have this lobotomy thing.
Yikes.
But so the main characters who are all in one cluster in different ways deny themselves for the sake of the cluster. Partly it's opening themselves to sharing. I mean, they share feelings, experiences, pain, all of that stuff. But it's also things like one of the characters, Leto, pauses his interview for this acting job that he really, really, really wants because he is committed to Sun and helping her do this bartending thing so that she can get revenge/justice against her brother who killed her father, all sorts of things. And so there's this willingness to put my stuff on hold for you, but also then other people do that for Leto. And so there's just this mutuality and building up of folks. But it also means that when one person gets, tasered, they all feel it.
Yeah.
Which is really scary if you don't know that they're experiencing something with a bunch of other people and somebody just starts seizing.
And then in verse 37 we read, "Indeed, what can they give in return for their life?" I've always kind of liked this verse, even though it tends to get ignored a lot in favor of verse 34 or something, because there's a lot going on in this passage. I mean, it's the Gospels, and that tends to be true a lot of the time anyway, but still. Because really, it's just saying that God isn't going to be impressed by your riches or your accomplishments. This is God we're talking about. What do you think you can give God that will matter after God gave you your life to begin with? It's the best argument against trying to earn God's love that I know, and is part of why I'm still Lutheran. And I grew up watching Star Trek, the original and Next Gen and so forth. And so I know better than to try to convince Q that you're smarter than him or that he owes you something, because that is never going to go anywhere good.
Who's Q?
Q is a recurring character who shows up every so often, and Picard was particularly good at getting Q into useful corners. But my personal favorite will always be Benjamin Sisko, who just cut out the middleman and started punching Q in the face. Which, you really sort of had to be there. Like, no one had ever tried that before. But yeah, Q is an all-powerful being, basically, or at least appears that way to humans because they are a sufficiently advanced alien race that we cannot understand their technology, kind of thing. And he's part of a collective, and they're all named Q. And he starts as a character in, I believe, the first episode of The Next Generation, where he shows up and demands the right to judge humanity for their crimes. And then Picard has to get out of that. So
Gotcha. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss the nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 17th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing, and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.